Good morning. Welcome to the webinar. I am Kabir from Battle River Research Group, and I'm thrilled to be your host for today's session. Before we dive into the insightful discussion with a special guest, Rocky Lemus, on forest diversification and management in changing climate, let's take care of some housekeeping. If you have any questions, feel free to ask in the end of the webinar or drop them in Q&A section or in the comment section. Now, without further ado, let's give a warm welcome to our expert speaker, Rocky Lemus. Welcome.
Thank you, Kabir, for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be with you guys today, talking about um, changing forest diversification of management and changing climate. Let me go ahead and share my slide here with you. Now, one thing when we talk about forest diversification, one thing that is very important is be able to be prepared for our birth condition. We know that there is a lot of changes coming in our forest systems, in our climate that have a large impact in the livestock industry. And one thing that I usually try to talk to people and producers is about why these forest crops are so relevant. You know, when we look at forage crops, they're going to be the backbone of the livestock production because without having farmers that can produce both high yield and quality feed to sustain a herd, will be very difficult to maintain productivity. We're going to be sacrificing milk production quality. We're going to be sacrificing animal health and productivity. If we look at the prices of commodity feed these days, they are very high due to inflation, due to shortages, and also supply and demand. So that's making forage production more appetizing and more viable when it comes to sustainability of forage production and livestock systems, not only in the US, Canada, but across the world. So one thing that also is that when we start talking about forages, they can help mitigate the changes in climate change by understanding how soil health, wildlife habitat, nutrient cycling, grazing management, and species selection, and the relationship between these axes and the farm economics can be able to make it more sustainable. Um, this is usually a complex issue. We have to think about multiple strategies that we can increase farm resiliency, especially under changes in climatic conditions. We want to be able to maximize on farm forage production and quality. So one thing that we think about this is there's also quite a bit of impact when it comes from the human, the socioeconomic, environmental, and climatic context of agroecosystems. Usually, most of the prevailing agroecosystems that we see at the present time are what we call monoculture, or they're more a linear system. So you plant at one time, you move to the next one. So they make this system more vulnerable to climate, to environmental degradation. So we have usually reduced health. We see more social exclusion. We see more private economic benefits than actually societal. So if we look at the forest agroecosystem, we see then that we do more what we call a landscape transition. We're going to have a more diverse system. We including different species. We have perennial systems, which is usually the key to make sure that we are actually also that's diversification of the system. We have a more circular system. So we have an integration of different forages that are going to keep that system going from one season to another. So by doing that, what we're doing is not only creating resiliency, but also we can creating ecosystem services. We can have more farm diversification, livestock production, wildlife habitat. So by doing that, we also improving health. We are actually increasing social inclusion and equitability, and also society economic benefits by having a more diverse system than just having a monoculture system. And we'll talk about more detail about that later on. There are some gaps when it comes to the capacity of modern forages to adapt to climate change. There are several studies that have looked at this, and one thing that they have concluded is the need for diversification of breeding material. For example, I'm going to use here two species, Timothy and meadow fescue, for example, had relative adaptive capacity, particularly to resilience to high temperatures during primary growth in high temperatures some 7 days after cut. All red clover cultivars, for example, suffer from both low and high accumulation of warm winter temperatures. So every time that you have low and high accumulation of warm winter temperatures, all red clover cultivar can suffer from those type of systems. One thing that they have been observed also that is that except for red clover cultivar, cold stress during winter and lack of warm winter temperatures consistently reduce the yield of all species and cultivars. So this fluctuation that we have in climate change really put our cultivars to its maximum stress. Try to determine which ones are going to be more feasible, which ones are might not be conducive depending on the environmental conditions. And because climate is a moving target, sometimes it's kind of hard to determine which of these cultivars might be suitable in those specific conditions. Although fescue cultivar, for example, suffer from low precipitation during the fall harvesting period. So if you have not enough precipitation as they go into the winter, sometimes can also impact the stand losses. Festolium, for example, cultivars are also sensitive to low precipitation during the fall. So it was a good example, enhanced product capacity to adapt climate change with high response and diversity. Because Festolium usually have a more diversified germplasm too, allows that to happen. When we talk about tall fescue, now we have the end-of-five novel end-of-five fescue, we had the toxic end-of-five fescue, and we had the free end-of-five fescue. Those free end-of-five fescue, because they don't have that relationship with fungal species to be able to be more resilient, we must see that those are going to be more short-lived perennials, which actually doesn't fit very well into climate change. See if I can move my slides. So when we talk about forages in a changing environment, one of the things that we need to think about is how this can impact us. And when I think about these changes, I think most of the producers in the northeastern United States, probably in Canada as well, will face more increased challenges and weather conditions for forage production. Even you guys already are in a very short window of opportunity to produce forages, including annual temperatures, extreme precipitation events, increasing frequency of short and medium-term droughts will have an impact on that. So one thing that we also need to think about is that most of you guys are relying on cool season perennial forages, which can become very unproductive in hot weather with little precipitation. So we need to think about how we can adapt to this. Producers need to look at strategies that can allow them to immediately adapt and do not require changes to their operations. And we'll talk about some of those later on as well. But just to give you an idea here, you can see that what are the major drivers to climate change? We have CO2 concentration, temperature increases, precipitation cycles, climate extremes, and also extreme weather events. So every time that we have this type of situations, we have direct effect on the production systems. Crop facility will have, and phenolic will have an impact. Water availability, soil and cultivation zones will change. In the U.S. already our USDA system had changed cultivation zones, and I expect that probably in another 10 years, we must see those cultivation zones and hardiness zones start to change and shift as well. So photosynthesis efficiency. Every time, depending on the type of species that you have, you might see changes in photosynthetic efficiency. And every time that you have an impact in photosynthetic efficiency, you have an impact on sugar translocation, how those plants will be able to do that. But also we have indirect impacts on production systems. Most of them are going to be related to pests and diseases. More humid condition probably is going to allow more pests to be available and be at different time of the year. But also invasive species. Every time that we change weather conditions, the species that are more subtropical in nature might be more adaptable to the conditions that we have in the US and Canada. So what that means is that we're going to see a cascading socioeconomic impacts. Farmers' livelihood might be impacted. we have abundance food supply that might be impacted, and also how we do our dietary habits on those systems. Just to give an idea of what the predictions are when it comes to climate change. And this is for agricultural production and the farm and family who operate these agricultural systems. If we look at the southeastern United States and the southwest USA, as an example here, you'll see we're going to experience higher temperatures and increasing frequency and severe extreme events, more tornadoes, more hurricanes, especially on the Gulf of Mexico. So what you see here is that if we look at the farm crop yields between 2040 and 2060, and we look at high emissions of CO2 in the air, what you see is that huge purple color. So more percent decline in yields. We have a higher percent increase in yields because we're more adaptable to that. But if that climate change, we'll see that in the northern part of the U.S. will have a decline in yield production. So you can see from 15 to 20% decline in yield production after we go north in the U.S. into Canada as well. When it comes to extreme heat and humidity, also they can have an impact. And we see that those impact between 2040 and 2060 is more in the Midwest. The weather becomes warmer, weather events such as rain, hail, windstorm are becoming more frequent and intense and can directly harm plant and animal life in those areas. Flooding is increasing and it's only made worse precipitation falls into land. So what we're going to see is that with land that have been engineered for drainage, it can now soak into soils that are compacted. So we'll have a lot of erosion issues. We'll have a lot of flooding and probably loss of crops in those systems as well. So when we look at the days and heat and the map, days and heat with wet bulb temperatures, we'll see that those temperatures are going to increase more and more in the Midwest section of the country. We need to talk about also how we can mitigate this. And then one of the things I think is very important when it comes to mitigation is looking at forest diversity benefits. We need to start thinking about moving away from monocultures and start looking at combination of forest systems that not only are more sustainable, but can help at maintaining plant cover, increase organic matter, and also be able to provide high quality forage nutritive value that will be beneficial to your livestock. So forest diversity will remain important ingredient in a stable environments. So when we're talking about forest diversity is usually described by the number of species that we have in there, what their functions are, and a spatial arrangement in the pasture. So some of these benefits will be provide, like I mentioned before, animal nutrition requirements, enhanced carbon assimilation, nitrogen fixation. The more legumes we have in there, more nitrogen fixation we're going to have, which means lower application of commercial fertilizer, and also turnover when it comes to soil microbes. So we're going to be able to see nutrient cycling. So we'll be able to see that when we implement better grazing management and we have these microbes in the soil, be able to break down that nutrients and cycle those back into the ground and be able to reutilize by plants. So this can actually contribute to resilience against drought and poor soil fertility. Another thing that we have to think about when we think about forest diversity is that it can provide habitat for pollinators and protection of the environment from pollutants. So in the absence of these disturbances, these mechanisms are credited for stability in climate and grassland ecosystems. So what are the indicators of forest diversity that promotes ecosystem services? So one thing when it comes to ecosystem services, I'm thinking about increasing species richness and functional growth of grasses and legumes that are responsible for enhancing productivity. So I usually think of several things. One is, for example, silvopasture systems. I think if we start thinking about silvopasture systems integrated into our grazing system might be something that might be beneficial in climate mitigation. Trees provide a buffer against extreme light intensities, temperatures, and wind. So they also support moisture retention and favor forest production for undergrowth. So cool season grasses that tend to be more adaptive to this environment fit very well. along with some of the legumes like a white clover, red clover fits into that system. Um, one one of the major challenges sometimes that we have to deal with this realization is the benefits is the poor species persistence. So remember when we're talking about silvopasture system, we might be talking about areas where a lot of trees that over time have acidified the soil. So low pH might also hinder which species might be more persistent, adaptable in the long term of that. So we might see some negative species interaction in adverse environments. So we might start to thinking which species might be had to be fit into the systems. But also we need to think about that from the practical considerations. I think that we live in a changing landscape. So we need to think about how we can proper manage graze and play. Grazing will play a major significant role in building organic matter, increasing plant wildlife biodiversity, and increasing water holding capacity. So in these systems, in these pictures that you see here, I show you 4 different systems that can be integrated. We have the silvopasture systems. We also have systems where probably animals like chicken can be integrated with livestock. And the reason for that is sometimes if the grass is starting to mature, they start to put seed heads. Chickens can actually benefit from utilizing those seed heads as an animal source. The integration of a small ruminant into the system also provides a benefit. There are species that are less palatable to cattle, but are more palatable to small ruminant. So that way you're complementing the system and maintaining the system more healthy, more competitive by maintaining that species balance as well. This is an example of what we see happening here. This is a producer here in Mississippi that I have worked with, and they have livestock, but also have chickens that free graze into those pastures. They have these mobile houses that the chickens are moving along when they lay the eggs, but can utilize the pastures. And this is a species we call a big yellow flower vetch, which is not very common in Mississippi. And probably the only time that I've seen it is in this place. When the producer started grazing with the chicken in these areas, these species started to pop out. So there sometimes you have species that need some help from the ecosystem services to actually be able to be resilient in those systems. So because the veg has this hard seed, once the chicken put it through their digestive system, they scarify that seed. And by scarifying that seed, then allow that seed to germinate. So you had this huge diversity then of big yellow flower veg complementing the grassy system in this farm. So they have benefit of utilizing a more diverse system without having to introduce other species. So we need to think also the what we call the functional forage diversity. So forest diversity is basically has a great impact in ecological process. So what we need to think about this is such losses are mainly triggered by disturbances like a forage and grazing management, land use, and climate change. But also we need to think of how those disturbances might be ongoing. Are we looking at seasonal occurrences? Are we looking at acute or chronic long-term effects with permanent impacts? So to do that, we need to look at those disturbances and what are the most vulnerable growth stages species will have more impact. For example, grassland burning combined with a frequent mowing during the summer have been reported to reduce grass fitness. So those that are using grass burning as a method of controlling other species might be something that had to be spaced out over time, not something that I would recommend to do every year. Another thing is overgrazing. Every time that we overgraze a pasture, we're delaying plant recovery, which means that make those plants more susceptible to competition, but also stand losses, especially under dry conditions or very cold weather. But also we need to think, excuse me, we need to think about disease damage. That's another example of acute disturbance. So you have irreversible damage to legume root nodules, for example. So every time that you have irreversible damage to legume root nodules, that means that there's no nitrogen fixation. So there is no production of nitrogen and return of that nitrogen back to the ground. So we also need to think about what I call genotypic diversity in how they're attached to climate change. Um, Increasing genotypic diversity of the forest system may be useful as a managed strategy for making sure that we have a more diverse forest system. But they're also associated with coping with weather variability and climate change. This usually, when we talk about genotypic diversity, I'm looking at three different systems. What I call the mixed intercropping system, which entails planting combinations in the same field at the same time without any spatial arrangement. So you might have several species in the same type of land competing for the same resources. And sometimes it can cause a problem if you have too many species in there, where you're creating a lot of competition. There's also strip intercropping, that means planting combinations in separate but adjacent rows. So you might have, for example, on the second picture, you have an adjacent rows or there with oats, but in the middle we have crimson clover, and then followed by oats and or wheat or other species. You can have several species in that intercropping, tree cropping system that allows livestock to utilize that system as well. Or we can relay what we call relay intercropping or stagger, which means planting at different times. And that depends on when your forage's availability and needs might be. We see that happen with some of the summer annuals, where you might have uh, sorghum Sudan per millet or sorghum Sudan hybrids that are planted days apart. And the reason for that is to allow to maintain those plants in more vegetative stage, that once you graze one pasture, the next pasture will be ready for grazing without having to lose uh, nutritive value due to maturity. So, so there are three approaches that also we need to think when it comes to intercropping. So one is increasing the number of cultivars. This is what we call interspecific diversity. Sometimes what we're doing is increasing different varieties of one species that we're planting together. A lot of the work that I've done in that area, I haven't seen a lot of benefit of one cultivar to other. And the reason for that is because a lot of the cultivars sometimes are one single trait selection. So one cultivar might be different than another cultivar for yield, but the root structure had not changed, the architecture had not changed. So we might not see that difference very much. Uh, the other one is what I call interspecific diversity, and that's what I like to see, increasing the number of species. So we might be looking at probably sometime um, a cool season annual, a cool season perennial, a cool season annual legume, a cool season annual perennial legume in the seed in those systems, or what we call forbs, and we'll talk about forbs later as well. Increasing both the number of cultivar species sometimes as another approach, what we call intraspecific and interspecific diversity. So you have to determine what is the suitable combination for perennial species and cultivar bred for those compatible traits to enhance resilience and productivity in those ecosystems. So forages also play a major role in forage diversity, and water. Water plays a role on that as well. So increased retention of precipitation, water, being intercepted by a large multi-species canopy and litter will have an impact on that. Grasses and mixers are reported usually to have higher water use efficiency and root to shoot ratio than monocultures. And the reason for that is because higher root to shoot ratio is a mechanism by which species acquire scarce soil or scarcer water with minimizing evapotranspiration. You're maintaining cover in the soil, you're maintaining that soil much cooler, so there's a lot of more moisture available, so allows those plants to actually extract water from different depth of the soil horizon. So that diversity in root structure and functions may also allow plant species to grow together and explore water from varying soil depth. Usually deep-rooted legumes versus shallow-root grasses can be a measure against drought stress. In this picture, I want to show you that what happens when you have water requirements for different species. Cool season grasses issue using rainfall water only need about 8.3 inches of water to produce biomass. But if you want to increase that production, then you're looking at an increase of 26.7 inches of water to increase that production where you want to be at. Um, The same thing happened with high quality native grasses. You see that high quality native grasses very similar when it comes to rain-fed production, but they are more efficient at utilizing average supplemental irrigation. Only 12.7 inches and 7.7 inches for natural native grasses were needed in this type of situations as well. Something that sometimes we don't think about much, but forest establishment and management for diversity is also something that is very important. Uh, Remember that when we increase in diversity, we increase in the number of species. So establishing become a very important part of that um, to make sure that we're doing a good job. Uh, one thing that we want to make sure is that this forest crop can sustain functions that transcend short-term management goal and seasonal factors. We want to make sure that this inspires the integration of perennial forest species and annual crops. Those two will combine very well. For example, having tall fescue, having orchard grass, timothy in some areas, and then integrating some legumes into that system. But as those systems go dormant or less productive, probably incorporating some annual crops, forest crops, might be something that I think can make the system more competitive and create that diversification as well. So when we talk about resilience and persistent or diversified forest crops, resilience is a benchmark upon a threshold in the consistent state following disturbance from fires, diseases, predators, adverse temperature, drought, soil erosion, salinity, and flooding. There's so many systems, so many impact factors that can determine resilience. So cultivation, grazing, and fire are the common disturbances in ground ecosystems in the US and Canada. And this may cause losses in species richness in gun cover. So in a more diverse plant community, the loss of species can be compensated by the regeneration of species which might have dominant effects on vegetation characteristics. Species that can be found to withstand fires in tall grass prairie is, for example, prairie dune grass, Sandberg bluegrass, western wheatgrass, and green needle grass. These species tend to be more productive in those systems and be able to be more resilient. So to give you an effect of an impact of sometimes when we had disturbances created by management, how this can impact these ecosystems. And the first one I look at here, that disturbance created by cultivation. This is a study that came out of Texas, tall Texas prairie grass in Texas. Uh, they're looking at symptoms of diversity index, species richness, species evenness. So what they have cultivation, what they found in this tall grass prairie was they lost a species diversity was from 4.8 to 2.8. So we lose quite a bit of species diversity in there. Loss of species richness also, we went from 42 species to about 29 species. And species evenness in this case, changing species evenness from 0.22 to 0.09. So there is we're creating an imbalance in the system by those type of disturbance. Similar system were looked at uh, soil organic matter with moderate grazing. This was done in the mixed prairie Mandan, Dakota, North Dakota. And what they found was that by doing moderate grazing, soil organic carbon loss went from 36.1 to 32, from 36.1 to 32.6 grams. So there were about 4 grams losses on soil, 4 grams of carbon per kilograms of soil in this type of systems. But also fire could be an impact on this. And this was also look at the tall grass prairie in northeastern Kansas and the mixed prairie in North Dakota. So and the tall grass prairie in northeastern Kansas, species richness was lost. Species richness went from 19.8 to 18.2. And in the mixed prairie in North Dakota, grassland ground cover also was assessed. And they found that reduced ground cover from 4.3 to 1.1%. So this disturbance can have an impact on those. That's what is important sometimes to have quite a bit of forest diversity to mitigate those impacts. So how to measure resilience? Okay. Uh, One thing that when we talk about resilience in climate change, there are limited thresholds that are set to explicitly determine resilience. I usually like to look at loss of legume density and biomass are the common measures to averse a species persistent in mixtures. But however, sometimes we need to think that these changes do not commensurate with species function. Stables doesn't mean that the system is resilient. And that's something that sometimes we need to keep in the back of our mind. And, to go back to that, those changes are not consummated with species functions. Here's an example of that. Usually when we look at established mixtures, alfalfa density have been found to reduce from 350 plants per meter square establishment to about 90 plants per square meter in 3 years. But despite of that decrease in stand density, atmospheric nitrogen fixation and activities of the nitrification enzymes increased to a peak of 30 to 25% with those seeding proportions. So sometimes it doesn't mean that because one species might decline in a system like that, doesn't mean that their function is going to decline as well. Um, when grasses dominate mixtures, there is a net accumulation of soluble nitrogen in the soil, which minimizes also nitric oxide emissions as well. There are more intricate interactions that can also help us uh, stabilize both forage and soil micro from the perturbations of the environment. So more diverse grassland communities have more shoot carbon storage and enhance stability against drought. However, at the expense of soil microactivity because then more fiber is there, which is harder for the microbes to break down. So let's look at the resiliency and productivity of grass legume mixtures. What do we need to do? Grasses and legumes are usually the major sources for nutrients and energy for livestock production. Grasses are rich in neutral deuterated fiber, which is important for livestock dry matter intake. While on the other hand, high protein may be supplemented by legumes. So some species that you might be very common in your species mixes are going to be the bunch forming cool season grasses. For example, for you guys in the north, orchard grass, tall fescue, meadow broom grass. Other species that complement that system might be alfalfa, birchwood, trefoil, sandfoin, white clover. This can be incorporated into the system. But also defoliation to the first harvest spring and subsequent deficit in soil moisture coupled with temperatures in summer may reduce the resilience in biomass production. So you need to be prepared for depending on the species that you are selecting. And this is an example of study that was done in Minnesota where we see that the study was done for 3 years looking at an alfalfa monoculture versus an alfalfa grass mixture that was added to that system. And in year one, the alfalfa monoculture, we see they have a slightly higher yield production compared to the alfalfa grass mixture. But by second year, we see that grass mixture, alfalfa grass mixture, have a much higher uh, production compared to the alfalfa monoculture. And the reason for that goes back to that previous slide where we talked about that the number of plants per square foot alfalfa tend to decline, which allows those grasses to be more competitive and have a better production in the system. So this is illustrated in these 3 years data that you see here on this graph. There's a large number also of species that can be incorporated to maintain ground cover. Cool season annual grasses are very adapted to this type of systems, and it's something that we use quite a bit throughout the United States and probably some parts of Canada can be also utilized. Annual ryegrass probably is one of the one that we utilize the most. There are about 3 million acres planted annual ryegrass here, and in my area, that's a lot of production ground cover that allows to sustain livestock production, but also you can have the combination of small and annual ryegrass to extend that grazing season. Most of these small grains like cereal rye, triticale, oat, and wheat can be planted along with ryegrass to get much early grazing production and then extend that grazing season as much as we can. Another thing that you need to think about when doing species selection is how they fit into your operation, how they fit into the climatic areas that you are in. And this is a good graph to give an example of that. This is a combination of looking at which species of small grains fits very well in different situations. If you're looking at something that is tolerant to low pH soil, for example, we see then that CRI have a larger advantage over the rest of them. Where if it's soil that have wetter condition, then tolerance to wet soil is going to be uh, another factor that you need to think about. Then we see that 3D Kelly becomes um, one that is more adapted to those areas. From the drought tolerance point of view, then 3D Kelly and CRI seems to have very similar capabilities when it comes to that compared to oats or wheat. Disease tolerance, the same thing. Rye and triticale seems to have a better adaptation to those conditions than the other small grains. And the early grazing potential, if you're looking at actually increasing that early grazing potential, we see here then that cereal rye and maybe triticale might be the most suitable in those conditions. Oats are very susceptible to cold weather, so probably it's something that cannot be planted in the fall, but it might be something that can be planted in you guys' condition in early spring to actually try to get as much potential, grazing potential in those areas. And sometimes excess potential can be utilized for storage for use like billage or hay production, depending on the environmental conditions. I'm a big fan of thinking about perennial cool season legumes incorporated into migration systems. And one of the reasons for that is because these cool season perennial legumes, they can fix nitrogen from 60 to 100 pounds of nitrogen per acre. That's a huge added value and bonus when it comes to the economic return from the grazing systems. So white clover, red clover, and alfalfa probably are going to be those three species that is going to dominate that that system when we incorporate into a grass legume mixture system. There's also a large number of annuals that I will consider more what I call a pinpoint grazing systems. There are grazing systems that can complement some of your perennial systems, especially in low quality forage, or try to extend that grazing season as much as it can, especially when you have more adverse conditions. And those include primarily crabgrass, sorghum Sudan hybrid, and forest sorghum. One of the things that we're seeing quite a bit with the systems is that we usually get about probably 60 to 90 days of grazing depending on environmental conditions. So they are not very productive for us in the South from the point of view of grazing, because usually we have a 6 months of grazing in the summer from early May until almost late October. So and in situations where your summers are much shorter, you're looking at 3 months versus 6 months, then this might fit that gap and become better pinpoint grazing systems. There's also the incorporation of what we call forbs, chicory, brassicas, radishes, canola might be something that can be incorporated into this group as well. Can be also complementary to our grass legume mixture systems. I'm a big fan of using chicory, especially for the small ruminants, because of the anthemic property they have with be able to reduce parasite issues based on the amount of alkaloids that they contain and secondary plant metabolite that might help with parasite mitigation. It's not going to be 100%, but anything that can be used in the grazing system to mitigate parasite incident is something that need to be considered. So another thing is that when we think about forest diversity, we need to think about from the point of view of microbial activity. Increasing species diversity is going to promote a higher ratio of different bacteria, especially the gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria for forest communities. A high ratio of gram-positive and gram-negative bacteria ratio can increase microbial community and disturbance, including drought. Also, the grass rhizosphere bacteria community on the grass legume mix planting can undergo changes, but that are dominated by legume rhizosphere bacteria. We're talking more, uh, most of the rhizobium, with the bacterial network becoming stronger and more complex. This also increased the interaction and stability and complexity on network coincided with increased above ground biomass forage. Every time that you have a good um, microbial activity in the soil, it's going to increase, uh, it's going to change aggregate stability, it's going to change water retention, what allows those roots to go deeper into the soil, extract more nutrients as well, and translocate those into biomass production at the top of the plant. So you have that advantage of maintaining a good microactivity compensated with increased biomass production as well. So, so diversifying species and the formulation of grass legumes can help also enhance crop resilience. And these are some examples of that. So for example, if you have an intermediate wheatgrass and alfalfa, that's a 35-65 seed ratio mass, can produce 2 and 3.2 times higher forage yielding in a 5-year study compared to intermediate wheatgrass monocrop in dry land conditions in North Dakota. So you see here the benefit that you have by incorporating some of those legume mixtures. Uh, Another one that was done by Carl in 2015 and Ashiyan in 2018 was that meadow brown grass with alfalfa. This was a 50-50 uh, mix, meadow brown grass with bird threefold and orchard grass with alfalfa. All of these generate 42, 45, and 40% higher yields compared to an alfalfa monocrop. Another study that have been done also in the Great Plains, and this actually was done in Iowa, was that a 50-50 binary mixture of smooth brown grass and alfalfa produced lower yield than the alfalfa monocrop. However, 3.5 times greater yield than the grass monocrop. So even though in this case might not be more uh, greater than the legume, but it was greater than the grass by itself in this case. And also there was a 3-year study done between New York, New Hampshire, and Vermont that indicated that added diversity did not result in higher nutritive value. Impacts in added species diversity were greater than impacts on added variety diversity within the species. So it depends where you at and what species have been used to determine the type of systems. I like to point this out. I think that this is something that if you're not familiar with, it's a great tool. This is was created, I think, by the Canadian Beef Council Research, and it's called Forage UPIC, and it's a tool that allows you to determine which forage species you should be selecting in your area. It allows you to do the seed rate calculator, but also do forage weed management. I played with this tool for a while now, and it's probably one of the most complete tools that I've seen. If you're in Canada and you have an internet, you can have access to this tool. I think it's free and has a good resource to determine which species you should be planting in your area. They give you climatic zones, they give you regions. So take advantage of utilizing this tool. I think it's a tool that can help you with your forage management selection and also how you're gonna manage those forages to make it more resilient in your locations. Another thing we need to think about also, and a lot of people don't think about this, but also native grasses. I think native grasses are a very important part of climate change. Native grasses have been around for a very long time. They're very resilient to climate change, especially heat and humidity, but also they can develop very deep root systems. So they can have a lot of benefits to soil health and soil quality. Um, One thing that you need to think about when you do it is grazing is much needed disturbance cycle for grassland health. There had to be grazing involved in this, but it's also how you graze this. Native grasses cannot be grazed as you graze your introduce or improve forages. Native grasses need to be grazed to about 6 to 8 inches and then let it recover from that. Sometimes you might be getting only 1 or 2 grazing cycles during the season, but they can be more resilient to climate change and still provide quite a bit of good quality forage to your livestock. So one thing that we see this is that when properly managed, grazing cows can magnify the ability of native grasses to sequester carbon as well. How is that? Because the cow tears the top of the bunch grass, the plant equalizes by reducing its roots biomass and then releasing carbon deep into the soil. As the plant regrowth, it pulls more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, and then the cycle repeats again. So you have a more continuous cycle by allowing that carbon sequestration process to happen at a greater scale that you see with some of the introduced or improved forage species, which have a very more shallow root system to do that type of carbon sequestration approach. Let's talk about soil health uh, and grazing management, holistic grazing management. because I think this is something very important that sometimes we need to think about how we can be better stewardship and how we can become very grazers. Um, when I talk about soil health and I talk about regenerative grazing, I think those two go hand in hand. You cannot have regenerative grazing without having some soil health approach. And one of the things that I'm trying to highlight here with the 4 points is how we'll approach regenerative grazing. There is a lot of people out there, what I call grazing gurus, providing expertise on grazing management. But one of the things that they tell producers, oh, you don't need to put nitrogen, you don't need to do weed control because the soils are going to regenerate themselves. But that's not true. That's not the case how a regeneration system will be able to be successful and resilient and stable for a long term. So when I think about regeneration, I think about the 4 pillars of soil health. The thing is we need to have a nutrient balance. So we need to start with soil tests. We need to find out what deficiencies we have, what soil pH we are at, mitigate those issues, and then identify those nutrient deficiencies and make sure that we provide them the correct environment for either the plants to grow or for rejuvenating those systems by introducing new species, renovating those pastures, and then make them more competitive and productive in the long term. So we want to think about also reducing soil disturbance. No till or reduced tillage can be the two approaches I want to take in that. That also we need to think about reduced traffic in wet soils in soil water retention. Every time that we start compacting those soils, especially by increasing traffic in wet soils, we might see more compaction, reduce and aggregate stability, and in the long term, we'll have less water retention. You have more water than moving horizontally than vertically in that system, and that's when we start seeing issues with erosion issues. But also, we want to make sure that we maximize cover and continuous living root system. So we want to increase forage diversity and biomass planting those. We want to focus on perennial crops. Perennial crops are going to have more cover throughout the season and the year that you're going to see with annual crops. If that's not the case, where you can incorporate that, we need to look at also integrating what I call cover crops. And this works very well when you have a crop livestock system integrated where you might have row crop, but you're going to follow with something that the cattle can graze. That fits into a system to maintain cover in that land. Also, by doing this, maintaining that continual living root system, we're increasing carbon sequestration. But also, I put it here IPM. When I'm talking about integrated pest management, is controlling the weeds. Yeah, there might be some weeds that the animals might graze when they're young and tender, but once they start to mature, they become palatable, they become a competition to your pastures, and you might have more issues than actually benefit from that type of system. But also, we need to make sure that we maximize the biodiversity by using rotational grazing system, incorporate legumes into the forest mixes, have that crop livestock integration, maybe some type of silver pasture system. But also by using the rotational grazing system, we actually be able to minimize paddock size and increase the stocking rate to actually be able to see a more uh, uniform distribution of your nutrients where the plants will be able to utilize much better. Here's an example. This is a producer that I work with in Mississippi that has followed some of the regenerative practices that have been preached by some of the grazing gurus that tells, well, cows will eat those weeds. This is a 50-acre field here that you're looking at, and it's covered with horse nettle and what we call duck fennel. These two species are very prominent in the southern United States. They are not going to be palatable to cattle, especially horse nettle, because it has spines on the leaves and then stems. It will not deter the cattle from eating it. Underneath here, there's a good base of Bermuda grass, but it's being hindered by the amount of weeds here. So in our initial assessment of this field, we calculated that this producer is losing about 80% of the grazing potential because of the weed invasion. But because he's following some of the regenerative grazing practices that indicates no use of herbicide, is losing quite a bit. This translated into him having to feed about $20,000 worth of hay last winter. So by the amount of hay that he spent, the amount of money that he spent feeding on hay, he could have a good effective herbicide program here to control some of those weeds and actually allow a more efficient and stable grazing system. So this is the same field that you saw, the field on the right here is the same field that you saw from here. And then this is the demonstration that we did with them. You see there where we took another 50-acre field that was in the same condition across the fence, and we applied Grazon Next, which is a herbicide that helps mitigate the two major species. And you can see the difference at 14 days after the application. So we actually opened that canopy where now grasses will be able to be more competitive and legumes in the system will be able to regenerate next spring and be able to allow that productivity to be much better. So one thing that we've seen in this type of systems is that when you have grazing management as a weed control, grazing can be an effective weed management tool. But remember, like I mentioned earlier, livestock will graze weeds when they're small. If the early vegetative stage of growth, many weeds have nutrient values equal or greater than desired group forages. However, the forage quality of wheat decline rapidly as the plant matures. And when we look at this graph here, where we have untreated area versus herbicide treated, and we look at the percent that has been grazing, we go from a 26% on the treated area to about 74% on the herbicide treated area. So it gave us an indication of the economic impact and the extent of the grazing season that you can reach by doing so. Another thing that we need to think about when we're looking at species selection is how resilient they're going to be to grazing pressure and how the recovery time is going to be. This is an example here where you have tall fescue that was caught at 2 inches every week versus tall fescue that was caught to 2 inches every 2 weeks, and tall fescue that was caught 2 inches every 4 weeks. You can see the recovery time, the amount of root system that you have, it's going to be very different. Every time that we cut or graze that forage too short, what we're doing is creating a system where there's not enough nutrient for the plant to recover, so it's going to have to go to the reserve and the root system and translocate the sugars back for growth. Every time that you do that, you shorten that root system. But if you leave enough biomass and allow enough time to recover, those plants will be able to maintain a more stable production in the long term and be more resilient to climate change, drought, other weather events that might impact the productivity as well. The same thing happens from the grazing management point of view and nutrient distribution. I think this is a good example of study that was done back in 2005. When we start doing some type of rotation in our pastures, doesn't mean that you're going to have to go and rotate those animals every day. But having a more continuous rotation and subdividing those paddocks will provide also a benefit to your system. If you look in your left where you have a continuous grazing system, and you look at these dots represent manure the distribution of those animals, where they at. You can see that the continuous grazing system is allocated here in this corner, probably mainly because that's what the water is. So they just come into the water utilizing that. But when we start making those paddocks smaller and rotating weekly, we can start to see that there's a larger benefit of utilization of the pasture as well, the manure distribution in the pasture. Animals rotated daily, which is something similar to animals rotated weekly. But also, those two have a benefit over a continuous grazing system. And there's not going to be one size fits all when it comes to grazing management and rotations. It have to be adapted to your needs and how you plan to utilize those species as well in your farm. No, every farm is going to be the same. Another thing that I like to talk about when it comes to forest diversity and climate is the utilization of cover crops. I think this is something that have taken a lot of interest in the last 10 to 15 years. And we see that from 2012 to 2017, cover crops acreage increased 50% nationally in the US. So we went from 10.3 million in acres in 2012 to about 20.1 million acres in 2017, and we see those numbers still increasing. So we're projecting that the United States is going to hit probably close to 30 million acres by 2030. So one of the benefits that you have with cover crop is that instead of having cropland that is being idle in the wintertime with very little production and exposed to elements, weather elements, you might be able to actually promote soil health, reduce soil erosion and nutrient loss by utilizing different cover crops in those. Um, Also, grazing cover crops can both offset the cost of cover crop management and provide significant soil fertility benefits because you incorporate legumes into the system. And the cover crops doesn't mean they have to be grazed, but it can be also utilized as a green manure for the subsequent crop during the growing season. But the key to proper cover crop is grazing management as well, how we can utilize those to our benefits. And this is an indication of what you see when you have the benefit of having cover crops during the winter and non-winter cover crop. You plant diversity is very small. You're looking at the pre-harvest cash crop. There's nothing after that. Just so your soil residue, so soil retention is very small. Soil microbes tend to decline much better. So you have reduced soil health, no forest revenue in that case. Um, if you look at ungrazed winter cover crops, this is the case where you're looking at probably a more manure, green manure type of situation. Most of those can be legumes. You see that this soil retention increases, but also microbe activity increases. You have cover crop costs, you have improved soil health, but you have no forest revenue. On the other hand, when you have a grazed winter cover crop using adaptive management systems, then you harvest that cover crop, you incorporate in a mix of grass legumes for those animals to graze. We see that soil retention increased considerably. So microbial activity increases as well because actually you do some nutrient cycling there. So you have cover crop costs, you have improved soil health, but also you have a forest revenue. So there's benefit for those type of system, and they'll have to be adopted depending on where location you are and what species might be available. This is something that I see a lot. I'm using this as an example. This might not fit directly to you, apply directly to you guys. Might be different species that we can look that are more suitable for you guys. But how to design a cover crop system? Um, to be honest, there is a lot of people recommending 6, 18 mixers, make species mixed together to a cover crop system. I don't see the benefit out of that. The reason for that is because you're really reducing uh, the percent seed composition of the species in some of the systems. You have different architecture, you have different germination times that really hamper which species are going to survive. So so for me, what I tell producer is to use the basic rule of thumb, that is to follow the rule of three and the principle of diversity. So what is the rule of three? The rule of three is to include a species, the three primary plant functional group, grasses, legumes, and a four in every mix. And then the principle of diversity is to create mixture containing a maximum of 6 to 8 plant species. Most of the producers I work with, we are in a 3 to 4 species, and the production is very comparable to those that have 6 to 8 species. And all these mixes can range up to 18 or more plant species. Another thing that you need to be very aware when using cover cross mixes is a lot of these mixes now being pre-formulated custom design mixes. So what that means is that these pre-formulated mixes are often put together by companies that do not understand cover crops, but simply want to cash in on the trend. So I want to make sure that when you buy a pre-mix, pre-formulated cover crop mix, that you read the label, know what are you paying for. I've seen this quite a bit in the South where ryegrass is utilized quite a bit. And when you look at those mixes, most of those mixes might be 60% ryegrass. So you're paying a premium and a very expensive uh, price but for a 50 pound of a cover crop mix that is 60% ryegrass. So it's something to keep in mind. Another thing that we need to think about also when we talk about forest diversity is that forest diversity will also have a livestock, have to think about livestock adaptation to climate change. Forests play a role in animal production and livestock production. So, and also livestock plays an important role in the global economy. So, so climate change effects are not only limited to crop production, but also affect livestock-based food security. So we need to think about multiple stressors that are likely to increase due to climate change. As probably heat stress is one of those to be the major factor that negatively influence livestock production. It is critical to identify specific climate resilient thermal tolerant animals to sustain livestock production that can also sustain forest production. So when we look at climate change and livestock production, we're looking at several things that we think about. Growth, for example, body weight, body condition scoring, average daily gain, feed intake, feed conservation, conversion efficiency, all those going to be impacted by heat stress. The same thing happened with milk production. You have milk quality, solid, non-fat milk protein, all of those are going to decline. Reproduction cycles will be impacted as well. Meat production, what is your pre-slaughter weight, hot carcass weight? Your fat score is one that could be affected as well. And heat shock proteins were going to increase. Meat pH is going to increase. Every time that we're increasing that pH, we're changing the chemical composition of that meat. Disease occurrence can increase as well. Every time that we have a better environment for sort of these diseases to proliferate, it's going to have an impact in livestock. And there's another, this pyramid is something that really highlight how these major factors actually of increase of CO2, increase in temperature and precipitation variation overlap with forest production and livestock production. If we look at increased CO2 by itself, you can see changes in herbage growth. More effect is going to be on C3 species or the cool season species. Uh, they're going to be decreasing forage quality as well on those cool season forage species, which cool season forage species usually tend to have better quality, better forage quality than warm season grasses. But there's going to be some positive effects on plants. You're going to close that stomata, you're going to reduce transpiration, probably you're going to improve water efficiency. But when we look at the combination of increased CO2 and increasing temperature, you see this here where forests can be affected by composition of the pasture. So we see a shifting in seasonal patterns. So you might have shorter growing season or longer growing season, depending on what species that you're using, changes in availability of water. But then here was what we see here with how they may affect temperature is in livestock. We talked about this already. So for decrease in nutrient availability, increasing water consumption 2 to 3 times, decreasing feed intake, feed conversion in animals, the production as well in dairy cows, for example, decreasing milk production. But when we had the combination, then again, increased temperature and increased precipitation, what we see is also that we have this overlap here of diseases. That's why diseases become a major problem. You have higher disease transmission, higher number of pathogens, parasites, especially in small ruminant might be the case, outbreak of severe spreading vector-borne diseases as well. But precipitation variation can have also a large impact on forages. You have long dry season decrease on those. So you have forage quality, forage growth, biodiversity, depending on which species you use it, and also flood changes can inform and structure the roots and leaf growth rate. All of those can have an impact. So it's not just one factor that can impact forest production and livestock due to climate change. It's more a synergistic combination of increase in CO2, increase in temperature, and precipitation variation. So one thing that we also need to think is how this improved forages can mitigate this. So usually we look at breeders are working on what I call more a climate smart forage systems uh, that are more adaptable, more wide, resilient to this type of conditions and changes. So every time that we have improved forages, we're probably gonna see reduce in soil erosion. We have better soil structure because of binding soil particles, and increased aggregate stability due to root system, more soil carbon output. So we can see that we can actually increase above and below ground biomass 2 to 3 fold higher sequestrations. We can mitigate greenhouses emissions through reduction of methane emissions from enteric fermentation per unit of livestock product, but also we can have less nitrogen leaching and gaseous losses to reduce soil nitrification. So having that root system and that plant that can produce is going to be very important, but I have to be adaptable as well. This is an example, just to give you an example, how I'm working in climate mitigation. What are what I call climate smart foliage that I try to integrate in my system. I mentioned before that we're starting to see that shift on growing zone because of changes on temperature and precipitation. And this is a clear example where I'm using brachyrias, which is a tropical grass, mainly in Central and South America. But I have come with the idea to utilize it as what I call a pinpoint grazing system in Mississippi. Usually, like I mentioned before, you can see in the back, here's the forage sorghum, here's brachyrias. Usually, all the forage sorghum, traditional summer annual forage sorghum per millet sorghum Sudan might have 60 to 90 days of grazing. So these brachyrias take about 30 days to germinate. So what we're doing is we're integrating the brachyria seed in combination with the sorghum Sudan millet or forage sorghum seed. And by the time that we start doing our first grazing, this brachyria is already coming up. Once we open that canopy, this is why you see that these brachyria start to produce a lot of biomass. And these brachyria can be productive from uh, June all the way until we get frost in late October, early November. And with little fertilization, we're looking at about 12% protein. Another benefit of this type system as Mark 4 is if you look at this brachyria, this is the root system that they are developing in 1 year. So for the soil health benefit, microbial activity, soil stabilization, you will have a lot of benefit by utilizing this type of system. So probably we're going to see a lot of shifting of these grasses from tropical and semi-tropical environment into the southern mid part of the US, and some of the traditional forests that we have in the Midwest being shifted a little bit north, probably into northern US, southern Canada, to try to mitigate some of those. And probably I don't expect that to happen in the next 10 years. Probably we might see that happen in the next 50 years, where we start to see the shift in forest diversity and acclimation and adaptation of species across the continent as well and across the globe. So to summarize, climate change and forest diversity loss represent still an existential threat to livestock industry. Among livestock system, grazing probably is likely to be most impacted by climate change because of its dependence to feed quality and availability. As farmland becomes less functional because less increasing stress from drought, floods, pests, and heat waves, the introduction of resilient forest system become even more important. So it's become more important to actually have a diverse system in your farm. And that diverse system could be an incorporation of grasses and legumes, but also can be the incorporation of just different species of monocultures that allow you to extend and rotate those animals and extend the grazing season. We're going to see a great increase in the structural variety and species diversity, maybe create with agroforestry systems, mixing trees and shrubs into annual perennial grasses and legumes to mitigate some of the heat effects. So we might have diversified cropping systems that incorporate complementary root growth strategies that can efficiently utilize nutrients and mitigate abiotic stress and degraded soil, such as nutrient deficiency, aridity, and waterlogging conditions. So beyond the diversification associated with forage crops, adding livestock diversity into a system can reduce challenges like pests and diseases while allowing for nutrient cycling for livestock to soil and back to forage species. So diversity within livestock system, we're having chickens, a more ruminant follow cattle in a pasture-based rotation also provide multiple benefits, including pest suppression. The impact of climate change on the beef industry remains an important topic of discussion today that requires additional attention and commitment. So with that, this is my contact information. Is down the road you think of something that we discuss or you have any questions, and you feel free to, you can either email me, you can call me, but also we have a lot of information we try to share in social media. So if you'd like to follow us in Facebook or Twitter, now X, you can actually utilize this information as well. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Rocky, for this amazing presentation. I hope everybody enjoyed it. Now, Rocky will answer some questions. If anybody has questions, feel free to write in the chat section or the Q&A. Are there any questions? Normally it takes like 5 minutes for people to
Yeah, we can be
ask
patient.
further. Yeah, awesome. I guess I don't see any question. Let's wait another 5 minutes, and if there's no questions, we can just wrap up. Oh, perfect. There is a question. Have you seen any issues with cover crops impacting moisture needs of the following crops in dry climate zones?
Uh, in dry climates, there's a possibility of that. I think some of the issues that we're seeing in the south with sun crop will be cereal rye. It's one of those that probably takes a lot of water uh, that actually might be declining what water is available for the following crop. In the past, some research has shown that uh, the possibility of ryegrass being one of those that can also cause those issues. But some of the studies that we had done with ryegrass, it shows the opposite. That because of the very fibrous root system that we have with ryegrass, we actually increasing that aggregate stability. We are actually increasing that water infiltration. But there's a possibility of some crops that can cause that, and the Praesia rye is one of those examples. And also, they had to do also when um, termination of the crop for following a row crop system. For us in the south, I think it might not be so much impact because we get a lot of precipitation in the spring, but also we terminating those crops uh, usually by late February, early March. Corn in the southern U.S., especially in Mississippi, is planted by the second week of March. So we got quite a bit of precipitation that we might not see those issues here, but it does happen in other areas, especially out west might be a difference. I've seen some of those issues in Oklahoma where cover crops might actually decrease the water table and the water availability to the subsequent crop.
Perfect. Are there any more questions?
With the carryover pest and disease, it could happen, and that's why usually, most of the pests and diseases that we usually see that are seen most of the issues seen is when you have a non-grazed cover crop. Because you have creating a canopy and harboring a lot of more diseases, especially in the wintertime. We have a lot of precipitation or moisture. We tend to be more fungal diseases. But by grazing those cover crop, you opening that canopy, we usually minimize the impact of insects and disease in those cases. So this is something that you need to be more aware when actually having a cover crop that is not being grazed but is used as a green manure.
Are there any more questions? Oh, I think so. Sheila got her answer. And Sheila wants to thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate everybody that participated today as well.
I guess let's wait another 2 minutes, and Jill also wants to thank you for an excellent presentation. Let's wait another 2 minutes, and if there's no questions, we can just wrap up. I guess no more questions. Perfect. Thank you so much, Rocky, for addressing those questions and delivering an excellent presentation. It was
Kabir,
truly a yeah, it was truly a pleasure to have you with us today. And to all the attendees, we appreciate your participation in today's webinar. We hope you found the presentation informative and enjoyable. This marks the end of our session. Thank you once again for joining us. If you have any further inquiries or feedback, feel free to reach out and have a wonderful day. Perfect. Yeah. Thank you, Rocky.
thank you.